The battle for the poor man's vote just got shriller. Congress President Rahul Gandhi has announced that if his party was voted to power, its government would roll out a minimum income scheme. NYAY, NYAY for please, or Nyunatam Aay Yojana guarantees 72,000 rupees a year to the bottommost or the poorest 20% of households. The scheme will likely entail an expenditure of 3.6 lakh crore rupees a year, given that there are roughly 25 crore households in the country. 20% will entail 5 crore or 50 million families in the poorest category. Hours later, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley called the poll promise a bluff and added that the Congress has a history of swindling people in the name of poverty alleviation. The Niti Aayog too dismissed the scheme. Vice Chairman Rajiv Kumar called this an election gimmick and that a scheme, if implemented, will take the Indian economy 4 steps backward. Well, the Congress then hit back. It said that the BJP is trying to mislead the public about the scheme and clarified that the scheme is not a top-up scheme, but an assurance to 20% of India's poorest families that they will at least get 72,000 rupees a year. Joining us to take the discussion forward are Professor Abhijit Banerjee, is Professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Lucas Chancel, co-director at the World Inequality Laboratory. Both have advised the Congress party, we believe, and helped it to design this scheme. We are also joined in a bit by Professor Himanshu, who is, again, Professor of Economics at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Professor Chancel, if I may start with you, sir. What exactly was your role in the preparation of the scheme?
Right, thank you very much for the invitation. And I should clarify first that I was clearly not directly involved in the preparation of the scheme. We exchanged with Abhijit Banerjee, who was, from what I know, more closely related to the discussions with the Congress. However, as independent researchers, as a group of international researchers, we have done scenarios and evaluations of different ways that could be used in order to implement this minimum income.
So in your estimate, will it be possible to identify the poor?
So, you know, that's the first key point that needs to be made about such a scheme. We need much more clarity, which need much more transparency about income inequality and wealth inequality data in a country like India. The current state of public statistics on distributional statistics that are inequality statistics is pretty low, and this needs to be the quality of those needs to be increased. So in the current state of the situation, with the data we have at hand, we can identify a certain number of households. We can identify a certain, amount of money that would need to be spent in order for the bottom 20% or the bottom 30 or bottom 50% to benefit from a minimum income. This is possible, but for sure there's a clear issue about data transparency in India, and this also needs to be at the heart of the current debates.
Okay, so what exactly did you contribute? You told them how to define the poverty line. What exactly was your contribution?
So, as I said, what we do as independent researchers is we did a series of analysis, and in our analysis, what was done is the evaluation of a top-up scheme, which apparently is not the direction that is taken by the government, but in my sense, it's still important for the Indian public, for Indian citizens, to have in mind different options that could be on the table. And this is an election campaign, so proposals can still evolve, they can still change in the coming weeks. So what is a top-up? A top-up is basically the government would add to a current level of income up to a certain threshold, so that all households below a certain threshold would all of them earn at least this threshold. From the point of view of social justice, this might be more justified than just adding a given amount of cash, say 6,000 rupees per month per household, to all households belonging to the bottom 20%, which is what I understand what the Congress Party has detailed yesterday. Now, from a practical policy point of view, the Congress proposal of yesterday may be more easy to implement because a top-up scheme is more complicated. But what we estimated is a top-up scheme, and basically what we have in our estimation in a top-up scheme of 72,000 rupees per household per year. Basically, this would cost about 1.3% of GDP. So 1.3% of GDP and 2.9 trillion rupees. And how many households would benefit from this? So it would be about 33% of households. So 33% of the population would benefit from such a scheme.
Okay. Well, actually, the party at the moment believes that it will try only 20% initially. Maybe 33 will be a later goal. I have Professor Himanshu also waiting by. He teaches economics at JNU in Delhi and is an expert on poverty studies. So, Professor Himanshu, let me just bring you in here. Since you have done these studies, are the poorest identifiable, according to you?
So that's actually really the problem. I mean, we really have no mechanism of identifying the bottom 20% of the population. If you remember, the previous history of the BPL census that we had turned out to be a complete disaster, and the Supreme Court had to intervene and get rid of it, and that is how we have the SECC. It is really difficult to get 20% bottom population. But more than that, not just identifying the 20% bottom population, but also trying to measure as to what is the deficit which will be topped up is going to be another nightmare. I mean, it's not just the implementation issue, it's also the conceptual issue. And I really don't know, what kind of a mechanism they have of figuring out actual income of the households. They've never ever done an income survey in that sense. And in many cases, for example, in agriculture or in other places where income is not a regular stream and it is open to fluctuations, I really feel that it will be a big implementation challenge. Identification is one part of it, but even otherwise, finding out the income and then what amount to be topped up is going to be another nightmare. I mean, if I'm not wrong in using a very strong word.
No, chances are, therefore, that the government, the party, if it is elected to power, may just agree to give a blanket 6,000 rupees per month per poor family if it is identified. But Professor Himanshu, you have seen, is it an easier scheme to go with the older things like, the Antyodaya scheme, where you just implement it in areas where people are poor, or the MNREGS, where the poor come to you asking you for a job? Is not that the better alternative?
Let me break it down into two parts. One is that, the previous UPA government, the records that we have, between 2004-5 to 2011-12, managed to lift roughly 14 crore people. That is what the estimate is. So growth is certainly the antidote to any form of poverty alleviation program. You cannot have a growth which actually reaches out to the poorest section of the population, which is much more broad-based, will certainly is the best way of helping people come out of poverty. The second is obviously the employment part of it, which is where NYAY became an important instrument of making the poor people become part of the mainstream. So I think these are the two issues. And if we are today saying that these are the growth is certainly not the one and we need to do some kind of a top-up, that top-up is to basically help all those others who are not able to take part in the economic mainstream. And we do have a program on that. For example, the widows, those who are elderly or those who are disabled, those are already being given the National Social Assistance Plan program. That is something which works out. But to give away the whole idea that the only way to help the poor is to give them money directly is in some sense also going away from the philosophy that was started by the Congress itself, that growth is the best way of reducing poverty. And they have their own experience of having removed poverty quite substantially in the first 7 years of the UPA 1 and 2 government. So I think there is a conceptual issue that is involved, and I wouldn't say that this is the only way or this is the surest way of removing poverty. If you are doing this bypassing the big question of jobs, bypassing the big questions of availability of public services, education, health, nutrition, livelihood, then I think this is something which is a kind of a regression or going back from the kind of a policy paradigm that we have on helping out the poor.
No, that's exactly the point. Let me get that back to Professor Chancel. Professor Chancel, that's how China solved its poverty program. That large amounts of construction which needed labor was drawn from the agricultural surplus labor. Jobs is the key problem. Now, in India, in the last 2-3 months or maybe 6 months, the debate has just shifted to this easier task of giving out money to the poor, which, almost looks like sometimes buying votes. What's your sense? If you just start using all your fiscal surplus simply as an income transfer, then there's very little left to build roads or railway lines, which will actually create jobs and public goods. Are we not trading off rather wrongly?
Yeah, I think we need to take this debate from perhaps from a broader angle, and this angle is how much India spends today on social expenditure, on social services, so education, health, and other social expenditure. If you look at the numbers, this value has been decreasing under this government as compared to the previous one. On average, it was 6.8% of GDP per year, right, spent on social services. With the previous government, and under the current government, it's 6.3%. This is a very low number. If you compare this to other emerging countries, it might be a bit lower in India, and if you compare this to rich countries, it's much lower. The value would be around 30% in rich countries. So there is a need to increase the value of social expenditure. Why? As you say, this can contribute, if you invest in hospitals, and if you invest in better school or in high, university level education, this can create jobs. But this also creates a much more trained, healthier workforce, and this is essential to have high and sustained growth rates in your economy. Now, if you say, okay, but we cannot increase the level of taxes in order to finance that, you can't do anything. And basically, I think, this election is the good moment to ask the question of how to finance additional social expenditure. Okay. How do you finance additional social expenditure? Well, you need to implement more taxes. And again, if you compare in an international perspective, the amount of taxes collected by India is relatively low. Okay. So if you want, it's relatively low. Now, there are different ways, to implement taxes. You can do flat taxes, so taxes on consumption, which will weigh on everybody and actually on the poor even more than the rich. But you can also do what many rich countries have been doing for many years. These are progressive taxes. Progressive taxes are taxes which weigh more proportionally on the rich, on those who have benefited from high growth over the past decades. And there's also money in there. This is also a mean to tackle inequality. And I think this debate on the size of the envelope of what is to be redistributed, that really needs to be open. Otherwise, we will always be in this discussion about how much is there left, and there's very little left, actually. So in my sense, to conclude, I think a minimum income guarantee is potentially a good idea. It's not a silver bullet, but if you look at Nordic countries in Europe, for instance, or Western countries in Europe, there are minimum income guarantees under conditions. And this is important to not let people fall into poverty. But this is also coupled with strong investments in social services, good quality education, good quality health. And these cannot go, and one cannot go at the expense of the other.
No, I take your point that India is spending much less on social services. Just a couple of arguments against it has been that the quality of government schools is so terrible that maybe it's a good idea to just give the poor money. But separately, my last question to you is that, there are other things that India needs. India needs more roads. India needs more railway tracks. It needs electricity to be reached to every home. Is there not a fear that in this zest to transfer incomes, parties are going to spend even less on giving these basic amenities? And of course, the allied problem of spending more fiscal deficit and therefore higher cost of money.
Again, it depends how much taxes you raise. In this new paper, we make a proposal, which I think needs to be debated in the context of these elections. What about a progressive tax on the top 0.1% wealth owners in India. This would yield, under very simple assumptions, and these needs to be refined, but under very simple assumptions, this will yield about 1.2% of GDP.
Okay.
And I think, there are additional ways to fund these measures. And again, if you think in terms of, okay, so it's either a hospital or a road, it will be really high to reach this ambition of making India an emerging superpower today and in the coming years.
Point taken, Professor Chancel. More taxes. To be fair, this government has tried more capital gains and the goods and services tax to get more people into the formal economy and make them pay taxes. But yes, we don't still have death taxes. We don't have estate duty, inheritance taxes. And as you say, the top 1% is what your paper is suggesting. Thank you very much indeed for enriching us with the ideas that governments can employ, though I don't seriously expect them to take that part of your advice of higher taxes, not certainly before the polls. We have